Hi, welcome to episode 25 of the American Tributaries podcast, where to break out of the bubbles we've all been living in these last few years, we are using modern technology to explore the various currents of people in our great country, kind of like a 21st century Lewis and Clark journey. I'm your host, Michael Whidden, and thank you for joining me in this exploration of America. If you enjoy listening, please subscribe in whatever platform you're using, give us a like in this particular episode, and check us out on Instagram at American Tributaries Podcast. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Nic Adams. Nic is a professional staff member on the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and where he's been since February of last year. And before then, he was providing advice on national security to a few different members of the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. Nic and I connected through LinkedIn by virtue, in part at least, because of our mutual prior service in the military. Although Nic's was for a much longer duration and certainly during a much more tumultuous time than my own. Nic, thanks so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks, Michael. Really appreciate you having me on. And as I mentioned, this is the first time I've done a podcast, so I'm excited.
Yeah, well, my first time doing the podcast with a professional staff member of the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, that's quite a handful, just a mouthful, just saying that. So I guess what can you tell me, like what exactly you're doing as a professional staff member versus, I guess, like being on the staff of a particular congressman or congresswoman?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think it's a question that we get pretty often. It's funny because before I came to the Hill, I actually met a few staffers while I was at grad school, and one of the first questions that I had for myself was like, "Wait, there's staff on the Hill? What do you guys do other than make coffee?" Right? That's kind of my first kind of impression, but it's definitely quite a bit more than that. So as you alluded to. There are, professional staff members on committees, and then we've got personal staff in a member's personal office. Really, the biggest difference I would say is, personal office staff tend to draft legislation, answer constituent mail, provide, do press releases, things that directly support that particular member's agenda. Whereas on a committee, we're focused a bit more on working with every member on that committee to achieve policy objectives or work on specific policy areas. So, for example, as a professional staff member in my current role, my responsibilities include oversight of components of the intelligence community. And one of the things I look at very closely is Middle East issues. So that's a very specialized kind of area that you wouldn't necessarily see in a personal office.
And excuse me. So then, are you dealing with, like, I guess, senators from both parties?
Yeah, I do. But interestingly, the staff is divided by minority and majority. So we do have a staff director for both majority and minority. So in this case, for Chairman Warner and Vice Chairman Rubio, and then each side of the aisle has a person assigned to specific oversight roles. But that is not to say that I wouldn't support a question or something from a member from the other side of the aisle. It's a pretty bipartisan place to work, which is a really great, I guess, perk of being on that committee. It's very national security focused. And so, by virtue of that, everybody is realizes that we're playing on the same team.
Mm-hmm. And were you involved with that? I mean, and I guess it's something that maybe 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, I wouldn't have thought about it. But I know, like, I saw on LinkedIn, and I think you were commenting on things that I saw as well about, like, the computer chips or that new chips legislation. So does that fall within your committee, or is it just kind of related to things that you're interested in? So that's why you were kind of aware of it.
Yeah, no, great question. I appreciate you asking that. There are components of that bill that did have equities that overlapped with our committee's jurisdiction. As you know, it's a pretty large piece of legislation, so it touched kind of everything from commerce to armed services, foreign relations, and certainly on the Intelligence Committee. And back in 2020, when we first drafted it, and the reason I was commenting on it is because I was one of the original drafters of that bill. And so we worked with several different offices on what do we need to accomplish to ensure that we don't fall behind in this tech race. And my boss, who I was working for, Senator John Cornyn, and I was in his personal office at that time. He asked us to come up with a solution, and the first draft of Chips for America in 2020 is what we came up with. As you can see, it took some time to get both the policy framework into law and then the funding into law. But I'm pretty optimistic on where things are now, that things are moving, and we're already starting to see some of those investments happening. So that I think that's, if I look back on one of the things that I got to work on as part of a broader team, obviously that's definitely something I can say I'm pretty proud that we got into law.
Yeah, I mean, that seemed to be a momentous accomplishment, and maybe a sign of some kind of like change or shift in the mood of Capitol Hill or not. I mean, when did you first get to Capitol Hill?
Yeah, I started in 2017.
Mm-hmm.
So it was right after I left the Army in 2016. Well, I should clarify, I left active duty. I'm still a reservist. So I haven't fully left, but which is good. But in 2016, I did a year at grad school. And then from there, after meeting some folks that worked on the Hill, I decided, what better way to apply my military background as well as the education that I got at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies than in the policy realm. And so I came to the Hill in 2017. So I've been, and that was in October, so almost 5 years now.
Mm-hmm. And when did you, I guess, first start thinking about being on Capitol Hill? I mean, I assume that probably also built into when you decided that you didn't want to continue with the Army, but maybe we should just go back. What's your career path been
Yeah.
to end up where you are now?
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at my resume, or if you look at my LinkedIn page, it all looks very linear, right? Like I went to undergrad, I pursued a degree in political science with an international relations emphasis. I spent 10 years on active duty. I go to Johns Hopkins for a policy degree, and I'm on the Hill, right? But that's what it looks like. That's not the way it went. It was definitely much less linear, I guess, than the way it looks. So when I went to undergrad, so I went to Boise State University in Idaho, which is where my dad retired when he left the Army. So that was his last assignment, was out that way.
So you're an Army brat as well, huh?
I am, yeah. came up in it. So I think it was one of those things where I said, okay. I think even as a child, I had a desire to join the military. September 11th, 2001 was a pretty formative experience for me. I was a senior in high school at the time. And so for me, it was one of those moments where it became clear that, while I've had these ideas since childhood to serve, that event really kind of hit it home. And so in my mind, I knew there was nothing else I was going to do than to join the Army. And so I actually, it was funny. I was planning on kind of waiting until after till after high school. I wasn't really quite sure how I was going to do it, but then again, October or September 2001, and then in October, obviously we began the first strikes in Afghanistan, and then I raised my right hand in December of 2001 at 17, and was ready to go. Which incidentally, I had to have my parents sign a waiver to allow me to enlist. So that was a whole separate conversation I had to have with both my parents, who were supportive, but my mom took a little bit more convincing. So
yeah. What did your father do when he was in the Army?
So my dad was a light wheeled vehicle mechanic. So he fixed trucks for 23 years, and he actually was kind of an inspiration for me to commission as an officer. He had a phenomenal career as a non-commissioned officer, and retired as a master sergeant. And his advice was, if you want to serve, I think that's great. Go to college, get a degree, commission, and do it that route. So, of course, when 9/11 rolled around, I wasn't really hearing that. I was like, okay, I'm going to sign up now. But my parents did talk to me and say, look, this is probably not going away. This whatever's going on, this is probably going to take a while for it to, you know, to resolve itself. Which, of course, in 2001, we didn't know it would be 20 years later that we'd be leaving Afghanistan. But that said, I did listen to their advice. I went ahead and applied for an ROTC scholarship at Boise State University and was accepted in early 2002. So right before I graduated high school, got the acceptance letter, and then the reserve, basically they just did like a paperwork shuffle. I was then an ROTC. I was contracted, and so I did that for 4 years throughout undergrad, and that launched my career in 2006 in the Army.
Wow. And then I guess, where were you assigned for your first assignment? And I assume you must have spent a fair amount of time overseas as well then?
Yeah. So again, so this was 2006, right? So we're at the height of two wars at this point. And you know, as a young 22-year-old second lieutenant, you know where you're going at that point. Although, you know, my initial duty assignment, my first duty assignment was to Germany. So I looked at my orders. I said, this is great. I actually wanted to be assigned there. I've got some family background there. My whole mother's side of the family's from Germany. So I said, this is great. It's an opportunity to get back there. As soon as I hit the ground over there, I was looking for an opportunity to deploy, essentially. And the first thing I kind of realized was that I was assigned to a large theater specific intelligence unit that wasn't going to deploy anytime soon. So I said, okay, well, this is a good place to learn. So I commissioned as an intelligence officer, and I was assigned to an intelligence unit. That all made good sense. After about a year at that unit, I started looking for, again, opportunities to go. And there was a company within that unit that was sending a component of the company, so a detachment, over to Afghanistan to operate the Hunter UAV. Which, you know, again, I think we call them drones in civilian parlance, but typically UAV or UAS in military jargon. So went down there and took a platoon of a Hunter UAV reconnaissance platoon. And then my first deployment to Afghanistan was in 2008 out in Jalalabad. And so that's where I kicked everything off.
Wow. And I mean, was there, I mean, I guess for anybody, I mean, and I guess for just a normal person, like, were there points where you were like, I don't know, like second guessing yourself or scared, or was the motivation something that just kind of propelled you through, or like, what's the mindset?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And I think, you know, I should say too that everybody's experience, everybody's motivation, everybody's reasons are different. And so I can certainly only speak to my own. And you know, for me, it really was an opportunity to serve, and it was the way that I thought that I could best use my skill set, my position in that unit. You know, whether it was the leadership of the soldiers that were carrying it out, and just the understanding and knowledge of that part of the country. So for me, it was, the motivation was to go do my job, right? It was, I had a job to do, let's go do it. And I had great soldiers. And honestly, you know, what matters most when you're deployed, I think, is one, taking care of your people and enabling them to do the job that we're assigned to go do. I think as the officer in charge out there, you know, for the 6 months I was there for that first deployment, my job was, you know, I don't want to say it was the least important, but it was definitely the job where, like, I had to make sure everybody else was good to go, right? And that's also what some of the non-commissioned officers do. But I had to ensure that the unit could perform the task. So that meant interfacing with, you know, our next higher command. It meant ensuring that you know, we were doing everything to standard, and it made sure the soldiers were taken care of and had the resources they needed. So I saw myself as kind of obviously the you know, leadership figure, but an enabler at the end of the day to make sure that we had everything we needed to get the job done. So my motivation was was that it was get the job done and have a positive impact where we were assigned, and get everybody home safe.
So I'm thinking about, I guess, your involvement with technology and your involvement with, like, the intelligence. I want to go on a different track, just because I feel like there's, like, one of the things that you see as you get older, is like you definitely see like the law of unintended consequences. And one of the things that, like, I wonder is, like, like with like the movement of like military engagement more to like drones, and like just with more and more technology, where like, I guess you have to kind of go where the trend is going, like, with anything. But like, do you, as you're, and I guess from your vantage point now, as you see things moving in a certain direction, do you also kind of sometimes sit back and be like, are we thinking about this, or are we thinking about that, or is there not enough time to think about that law of unintended consequences? um
I think that's a really good point. And I think we do think about that. I think we have to think about that. And one of the things that is important for policymakers to get right, and for us as staff advising those policymakers to get right, is to think through unintended consequences, second and third order effects. I think we do that in a variety of ways. And so one of the great things about being a Hill staffer is that people want to talk to you. So we may not be popular by our personalities, but certainly by virtue of our position. And so you've got lots of advocacy groups. You've got the executive branch, a number of folks who, when we start crafting these policies, will have input in how those things ultimately come out. And that's a great opportunity to really think through what those second and third order effects are going to be. I think when we looked at the CHIPS Act and drafting that legislation, we tried to get something out pretty quickly because of how legislative timelines work. But even then, we took a great deal of time to negotiate legislative text among other member offices, as well as getting that critical input from some of the key stakeholders that were going to have to implement the law once it was passed, and B, folks that would be impacted by it. So we did have those conversations, and as I pointed out, it took 2 years for the funding to be passed in the law. That was another opportunity for folks to come in and have input in how that final passage looked. Mm. So there are some benefits to government moving a bit slower sometimes. There's a lot of frustration with Congress sometimes in terms of passing a budget or passing a bill other than the National Defense Authorization Act. But I think, as the last 2 years have pointed out, Congress acts when we need to, and I think that some of the timelines are impacted by the critical importance of ensuring we get the right voices heard and the right input, included before we roll out something that's going to have a pretty significant impact on really the next generation of Americans.
Yeah. And like, I guess the reason why I was thinking about that specifically is I was, it was an Instagram post, but it made me think about something, because there's somebody saying, like, we pay for these fighter pilots, but why do we do that when you could have somebody where you could have a drone fighter craft out there, and you don't have the risk of life, you don't have the training and everything. And I just like thought about it. I was like, you're making that kind of suggestion in a bubble. Like, I don't know what happens to warfare when there's no people involved and it just becomes a video game. I don't know if that's any better or worse, but there certainly seems to be some kind of, I don't know, paradigm shift in how countries engage. And I don't know, again, I don't know that you have the luxury of kind of going that far out, but that's the kind of thing that gets me thinking, as people kind of get excited about technology, as we've seen, like, domestically, there's good things, but there's also like bad things that you can foresee, and then there could be really bad things that you can't foresee.
Yeah, I think I like that you brought up the drone aircraft issue. I think the other thing we have to keep in mind, though, is that what are our adversaries doing? And are they going to take as much care as we will when it comes to employing some of these autonomous weapon systems? So, as a joke, I've said before, well, if we don't build Skynet, the Chinese will. But that said, again, you have to think through how that works. And there are laws that we have for good reason that we put into place to make sure that as we develop these systems, and that, if these systems do end up showing up on the battlefield, that we do this in a way that is ethical, it's moral, it follows the law of war. Um, these are important questions, and there's another reason why the United States has to be a leader in technology development, but also technology policy and standards development. And I think if we look across the world, we by virtue of having essentially owned the internet for so long, we were able to set a lot of those standards. But now you're seeing a lot of other and more divergent things being taking place overseas, whether it's the privacy law in Europe or whether you've got some of the investments that China is making in quantum computing and AI and some of the maybe next big ticket technological items. The United States, we owe it to our citizens certainly, but I think to the world and to the greater stability of the world, that we're at the forefront of that, and that we set the standards, we set technology policy, and we do it in a way that ensures that these things are designed, developed, and then ultimately fielded in a way that it adheres to all those things I just described.
It's interesting. It's almost like it's the micro version of the space race.
Maybe micro, but in some ways, maybe it's even bigger than that, right?
Yeah.
Because I think if you look at the space race, and by the way, I don't think that's over yet. Unfortunately, we took like a 50-year break, and that's
Yeah.
probably unfair. There's a lot of good work that's been done since we went to the moon, but I'm very encouraged to see that we're going back, because ultimately we can't accept that there's nothing to be had out there, and I think the way that we're going about it now is fantastic. But if you look at the data race, the tech race, it's maybe a miniature version because it's not leaving Earth, but in many ways, it's going to have such an implication on the future of our entire history in terms of, again, who sets the standards? Will it be a Chinese centered, technologically focused world, or will American standards ultimately be those that are the ones that the world recognizes as the gold standard? And so I think we really need to ensure that we're at the forefront of that. And so in some ways miniature, in some ways I shudder to think what would happen if we're not if we're not in the lead there. So
yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I guess macro results or macro consequences, but micro as far as like where it's happening.
Sure.
But yeah, no, but that's the thing that I guess that I've got, like when I've been the last few years I've been trying to kind of rewire my mind or reorient my mind to kind of, I think, see things more broadly than just, I think if you can go through your life and wherever you live and you can kind of start getting caught up in your bubble, and then I think like technology and just a lot of things kind of like let your bubble like reinforce and get closer and closer and smaller. And as I've tried to like, I guess, open it again, think about our country, and I guess the thing that always kind of gives me, I guess, the hope is, like, in any of those other countries, I mean, every country has its flaw. And I think that was like, I guess, I'm sure in your service and traveling, you saw it. And I saw it when I lived in Japan and traveled all over. It's like, every country's got its like really serious problems and has its egregious, sins that it's committed as well. But like in the US, I think there just seems to be, we're so big and so vast and so diverse that like the skills in our country can kind of come from anywhere. So like at the end of the day, I mean, it sounds delusional, and I'm not like kind of like, I don't know, getting like overly patriotic. I just think, as a matter of fact, when you have 320 million, 330 million people in a country our size with so many different resources, as long as you do have enough, and I'm not subscribing to the idea of like unfettered freedom, but like you need enough freedom to like let people tap into their own latent skills. And with that, we can do anything. And I think about like in the military context, and I was never in combat like you were, but like if you can't give your soldiers enough orders to cover every particular scenario they encounter, they have to be able to think on their own. They have to be able to improvise. And I think that's the beauty of having, I guess, a country with freedom, is that you do give people that freedom to make a change. And when you think about any country where it's a dictatorship, if they don't have that kind of freedom, then I think it's almost inevitably doomed to catastrophic failure because it's too brittle and unable to improvise, whereas we still have that freedom here.
I think that's spot on, right? And I think a lot of people who haven't traveled overseas and haven't seen how things are in other countries, um, are maybe quick to maybe criticize is the wrong word, but point out certain flaws that while certainly America, everybody's got issues to work on. Nobody's perfect, certainly. But there have been some places that I've been overseas where, yeah, I mean, Afghanistan's a great example, right? I mean, if you want to talk about oppression, I mean, you can see what the Taliban are doing today to women and minorities, and so those are things that I would remind people that in America we're willing to have a conversation about that, and about any and all things that somebody would like to point to that might amount to criticism, and that's the importance of being in a free society, is having those open discussions. Whereas in other countries, that often that discussion doesn't even take place because people are silenced immediately. It's interesting too because that freedom, those are things that combine all of us, right? All of us as Americans have that, and it's interesting because when my mom moved to this country and she actually became a U.S. citizen, she's from Germany originally. In 2016, one of the things that she remarked was, you know, this country's so big, it's so diverse, it's got so many different people from all walks of life. But unlike in some countries in Europe or elsewhere, anybody can be an American. And unlike in some other places, there's this idea that unifies everybody. And those are the ideas that are enshrined in our Constitution and in the Declaration of Independence. And those are things that every American, regardless of where you're from, if you're an immigrant, if you're born here, those are things that we all have. And those are things that unite us. And I think when you go to a baseball game and you see the flag, and we sing the national anthem. I mean, what a beautiful thing to see, to know that there is that idea that unites all of us. So
Yeah.
I know that notion isn't always shared among everyone, unfortunately. But I would remind people that that freedom does exist, and so does that ideal that unites everybody that lives in this country, and that indeed everybody in this country can be an American by choice, and that's an amazing thing that I don't think really can be replicated anywhere else.
Yeah. It's funny. Two things come to mind when you mention that. The first is sometimes there is a bit of, I guess, condescension, or people like you, and I live in New York City. I live in a more like liberal blue bubble, whatever you want to call it. And there's and I think that to the detriment, and I like to think that slowly people are reconsidering this kind of like reaction to things, but there's a little bit too much like, why are people so into flag waving, or why is there so much pride in America, or flags, whatever. And I think that to me the reason why is because I think you nailed it on the head, which is like America is an idea more than is anything else, and when it's an idea, it is going to be constantly subject to people wanting to talk about it and wanting to shape it and wanting to brag about it or to criticize it, and it really is everybody's, so everybody has a voice, and you're going, and so it's subject to our constant input. Whereas if you're a country that was put together by treaties, or if it's you go back hundreds of thousands of years, it's just a different concept. The other thing though that I was thinking about when you said that is, I started this education travel company in March. I left my last job because I wanted to start getting kids from the high schools from the New York City area to travel to other parts of the country, so we can like get back to like learning about each other again. And I chose South Carolina as the first destination. And as I was putting together my itinerary, and I was talking to people who I knew who lived down there and had lived down in South Carolina for a while, and I would ask them like, hey, what would you recommend, or what are your thoughts on my itinerary? I'd get these reactions from people like, well, I mean, I've lived here for 25 years, but I really should talk to a native, because like they didn't want to kind of like venture to opine on something, even though they'd been there forever. And it was surprising to me because like in New York, you can be here, you can get off the train, get off the airplane, and you can be a New Yorker like in a minute, right? It's because it's really more about attitude. And what it makes me think is like, New York City to the rest of to the country, to a lot of different parts of the country, is like the U.S. to the rest of the world. Like, you come here, you can be you're an American the second you walk in. You can have that American attitude, and that's one of the things that I've been preaching to people. I think when you think about America, is like, we are just more independent, more self-reliant than anybody else, because every one of us left, either forcibly or voluntarily, some kind of ancestral home someplace else to come here and to survive here without the community safety net that you had, whether it's Germany, Italy, my wife's family, Taiwan. Even if you're a Native American, you were forced off your land. If you're a Black American, then you may have like the horrors of like slavery in your background. But either way, like, everybody had to adjust and get by on their own. And I think that, to me, is like the indomitable American spirit that does differentiate us from any other country in the world, just a bit, but a substantial bit.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. This is definitely a country of immigrants, and everyone that's come here, I'd like to think, has made this place a little bit better, and it's actually one of the reasons why we should continue to attract the best and brightest in the world to come to our universities, to come here and contribute and become citizens of this country. And to ultimately carry on that American dream to the next generation. And a lot of that sounds very, I don't want to say cliche, or maybe it sounds like something you might see in a campaign poster. But I mean, really, that's the ideal we're talking about, and that's something that I think is missing in many other places. And your point about the lack of a safety net. I mean, I think that's if you're out here, as this country is being built, that certainly, I think, has just remained part of the American identity, even to this day.
Yeah. Although, I mean, I had I had a couple of days out west in your very general neck of the woods when my family and I were on vacation. And like, there's definitely the living without a safety net in like Montana, Wyoming, Idaho is much, much different than living in New York City without a safety net.
That's a fair observation. Yeah.
Like, I can change a light bulb in my home that I don't know that I would do anything else without hiring a professional. Whereas I think you need to have a much broader skill set for your home if you're living in Idaho, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, right? And that's one of the things I love about this country too, is how different it is, right? And that's why when I fly from east to west, sometimes I just like looking out the window,
Yeah.
because you can see how everything changes. And so it's not just the people that are diverse; it's obviously our the land and everything else. So yeah, it's great to get out there, though. I haven't been back out there in some time, so I need to hopefully get out there to visit family. But it is a beautiful part of the country. I'm glad you had a chance to go. And I love the idea of getting people together on the American Tributaries travel, just because that's, I think it's one of the things we look at when we go overseas too, right? And I mean, in the military, one of the big things that we've always focused on was exchanges, right? Training with foreign partners, and in that context, it makes a lot of sense to have folks from allied countries training at our schools. And so, when I was at airborne school in 2004, yeah, geez, that was a while ago, and down in Fort Benning, Georgia, we had folks from the UAE, Saudi Arabia, the Republic of Georgia, a few others that were down in our and I think we had a Hungarian soldier too. The point is, we had folks from our allied allied countries and partner countries that were out there jumping out of planes with us. And I think that's just something that when you do that with somebody, you kind of you got to form a pretty tight bond really quick. But two, again, it builds that trust and understanding between different people. I think in many ways that applies to this country, and obviously, somebody going from New York to South Carolina is not quite the same as a Kuwaiti soldier training with us at airborne school. For one thing, you don't have the language barrier, although many might argue that there is a language barrier between New York and South Carolina. But again, that there are so many nuances to American culture, right? And the idea of getting folks together to talk about things and to hear each other's points of view and just to experience that, I think it's a phenomenal idea. And I think we should be doing way more of that, both internationally, but I think within our own country.
Yeah. You know, um, when I look back and like I've in my own mind, I have kind of a narrative in my mind that I think makes sense that kind of explains how we've gotten to where we are. But one of the things that I think about is like when I joined the service, like the very first one I joined, it was with Navy ROTC, and my freshman year at Penn was like 1989. So when I started Navy ROTC at Penn, there was still a Berlin Wall, and then it came down. And I think like one of the things, like when I try to look at like how do you explain where we are now, to me I feel like at that point you had the end of the Cold War, so you lost kind of like some unifying counterpoint, some unifying enemy. On top of that, I think that when we came out of that, like the idea of globalization, like was something that was like exciting. The whole world was open to you, right? So we all go out and we start exploring other countries and we start trading with other countries. And then you had technology, which kind of like was the fuel to the fire on that and that to that connectivity. And I feel like, and I guess this ties into like how we connected, which was with that. I think it was you had posted something about the Vanderbilt the project on unity and American democracy. But when I think about where we are now, I kind of look at it as like, there's a lot of reasons I think to be um, that where I think you say, we could be doing better in the country. But I think that over the last 20, 30 years, I think we have lost touch with each other. And I don't think it's necessarily one person's fault or it's because of some conspiracy. I think that the global trends took us in these positions where we've been looking outward a lot and by necessity or by distraction. But now here we are and we're like, wait a second, there's 330 million people here. We need to get to know each other again. At least that's how I put my project in that context, to just say, we just need to get refamiliar with each other. And we're all going to be different, but we just have to learn to start, I guess, working or I guess understanding those differences and focusing on what we have in common, focus on our common, goals and objectives, and try to iron out where we can the differences and overlook some of the other differences. And if we went by there, then you just have a few things which maybe become, I don't know, like not irresolvable, but also something maybe you don't have to deal with. I don't know if that makes any sense, but at least that's how I
No,
kind
it
of
totally
view
does.
things.
It totally makes sense. No, I think that's huge, right? I think that's, and by the way, what you just mentioned something that really made me think about, again, to tie it back to what I know, which is my time in the Army. Um, the Army is such a great kind of representation of the United States. And again, I'm sure people can look at where most of the recruits come from, and if certain areas of the country are disproportionately represented versus others. I haven't looked at those numbers, so I can't speak to that. But what I can speak to is that everybody in those units is united by that idea of service, right? And it doesn't matter where you're from. It doesn't matter what you look like. It doesn't matter what language you speak at home. You're an American, and you're there because you volunteered. We don't have a conscription army, so everybody's there, and you learn from one another. And what I love about my experience in the Army was just the fact that there wasn't this there weren't really lines that divided us significantly, at least in my experience. And again, I'll never speak to anybody else's experience because I can't walk in anybody else's shoes. But from my biggest takeaways in my time in service, aside from again my deployments overseas and my time spent there, was just the amount of camaraderie, and that it didn't matter where you're from. What mattered is why you were there. And that was huge. And by the way, I'm glad you mentioned the Vanderbilt project on unity and American democracy. They actually first caught my eye late last year. One of my really good friends and former colleagues is the program director there, Grace Galvin, who, by the way, if you're looking for folks to interview, she's got a great story and is pretty inspiring. So
Okay,
I don't want to
great.
tell her story, so I'll let
right.
you potentially do that if she's interested in coming on. But
Right.
they are doing some phenomenal work there in getting people to talk. Right? I mean, that's what's missing is talking or with each other rather than at each other or past each other. And so, if we're talking about like, okay, what does the future look like? It's going to be folks like the folks at Vanderbilt. It's going to be people like Seth Radwell, who I think we were able to get an introduction there, who just published a book about what is driving American polarization, and it's trying to really get at at that, right? Like what is causing it? How do we fix it? Like where are ways we can improve? And let's focus on some of the things that, while acknowledging that there are issues to work on, let's do this together, and let's acknowledge that we're in this boat together, rather than casting this as a us versus them, zero sum game. To that, I would say, if you want to find the enemy, we've got plenty of enemies overseas, unfortunately. And as much as I would love to have a world in which we could all, get along, if I could put it that plainly, that's not the reality that we have, at least geopolitically. But I think as Americans, what we can impact is to bring the vitriol down in political discourse, and get back to hearing one another and listening to one another, and trying to solve those problems together.
Yeah. And when I've talked to people, and I've tried to be as, I guess, I try to talk about, I'm open to talking to people about these kind of like civic issues. I don't know, wherever you might be, wherever you are on the political spectrum, because I think it's important to be able to try to have these conversations and navigate them productively. But like, even like in the New York City bubble, I feel like there's a lot of people who feel like we do need to have more civic engagement, or like kind of like almost compulsory national service of some sort. Like, this, I don't have to look hard to think of conversations where people say, yeah, like, you should, have a compulsory year where you're, either teaching or, working for the Forest Service or something. I mean, like, my idea, even for my company, was like, what in the US, we should almost have a compulsory like half a year during your high school where you go live someplace else, someplace that's radically different, whether by race or by geography or by politics. But you should, because we need to like build the webs. And I think that's kind of part of the thing, is like a lot of what's been happening in the last 10, 20 years has been siloing us. And there hasn't been anybody trying to kind of make those unexpected connections, which I think we need to make. And that was like when I reached out to you, I'm like, I have no idea if this guy's going to respond to me, but if I want to try to make new connections, I've got to do these random reach outs. And I feel like that's the kind of thing we need to have those random connections again, not just like people self-select the same kind of person with the same kind of background and the same kind of interests. Are there discussions on Capitol Hill about, like, I guess, like, efforts to kind of build back some kind of sense of American community or understanding or civic responsibility without it kind of becoming overblown, at least?
I'm sure there are. And I'll say that, in our committee, we typically don't focus on that particular issue as much.
Right.
But yes, I mean, ultimately, I think a lot of people recognize, the issue, and they recognize that there is very detrimental polarization in American politics. But again, I think part of it comes down also to the elected officials doing the right thing, even when they're faced with criticism. So Senator John Cornyn, who I just mentioned, who is my boss on the committee, is a great American. He was quoted recently in a news article, and when asked about one of the bills he recently worked on, his reply was, "Well, legislating is not for sissies," and it's true. You have to be able to to take the criticism sometimes and step up and do it. So folks like him are very inspiring, and they show that when push comes to shove, we can come together and make things happen. But to your point about those conversations, certainly at the staff level, there are a lot of conversations that take place about how do we really approach this problem. One of the things that I think is interesting, I think this is probably an issue across government, maybe across the private sector too. There are so many issues that require attention that sometimes it's hard, unless you do it consciously, to think long term. And I think budgets are a great example. There's probably a reason that you see a continuing resolution passed almost every year. I think part of the issue is that it's making sure that we have a long term view, even as we're working on addressing short term issues. So those are certainly things that are I think apparent to everybody. It's just a matter of, again, having the conversations and shaping those policies in a way that, while taking care of short-term issues, we address the longer-term problems.
Well, and I think the other part of this, and this is I guess why I started my company, and like this, it's through a great amount of, frankly, of like kind of personal turmoil, because it's not it's definitely a financially precarious thing to do at the age of 51 with 3 kids, to try to start a company. But I guess, while it would be nice to say that, oh, we should just look to the government for every solution, I think that the government is so big, that I think you can't wait for the government to come up with every solution. And I think that, to me, that's where, like, one, I was like, I just want to do this myself, and two, like, I realized that when you talk about unity, especially from like a political viewpoint versus as a citizen, it can become a political cudgel. In other words, we want unity, but the unity is you have to do what we say, and no, I don't think either side has a monopoly on that. I think that's what it can, to me, that's what it can come across as. And when I've been trying to reach out about this, I really and do sincerely mean that. I think that above and beyond anything else, the most important thing is that we be able to have respectful conversations. And I can't think of really any single issue which I think is so important that we should have, disrespectful conversation or yelling and screaming. And I understand that it can happen, and I understand there's a lot of emotions. And I like to tell people, like, I'll try to preface like almost any conversation I have with, like, look, this is my viewpoint, and I realize that as like a white Christian raised heterosexual able-bodied male, that I have a viewpoint that is very different than a lot of other people with any number of different backgrounds, right? So there's a huge caveat to any of our viewpoints, but all of our viewpoints then do have a caveat. So I don't even know where I'm going with that, but I think that to me is still
Good.
the most important thing. Is
Yeah.
like, I want to have a conversation. I want that's what we need to do, and I can see it on the left as well as the right. Is there are people on my side of the political spectrum that you can't have a conversation with because they are very fixated on their particular ideas, and I'm sure it's the same on the other side too.
Well, I think you make some good points, but I think it comes down to empathy, right? Because just because you're a white male heterosexual Christian doesn't mean your viewpoint shouldn't matter, right? And I think that we run into some of these issues now where there's a lack of empathy, I think, across the board, not in everyone, but certainly in some folks that will immediately put you into a bin or a bucket based on how you look or where you're from, right? And again, I think it's a theme we've hit on a few times in this conversation. But we have to be able to empathize with other people while not compromising our own values. And so I think it's an important viewpoint. That I think it's an important voice. I happen to also be a white male, straight Christian, Catholic white male. So at the end of the day, does my viewpoint matter any less? The answer is, of course, it does not. But I obviously need to be able to empathize with folks whose viewpoints are different, whose lens at life or the lens through which they view life are different. That's very important, certainly for me. I think for anybody, because nobody can truly understand what other people or other groups of people are experiencing unless you've walked in their shoes. So that's where it goes back to having the conversation. And that's where I think it goes back to, the unity piece. And again, that doesn't mean everybody has the same opinion. We shouldn't have the same opinion. We should vigorously debate everything that goes on. That's what makes this country so amazing, is that we can do that. And to your earlier point about not waiting for government, I also fully support that, right? I mean, private enterprise, entrepreneurship, investing in some of the things that are going to make this country better and make the world better. Those are things that are going to come from our brilliant minds that are not necessarily in government, and in many cases shouldn't be in government. And so supporting that, I think, ultimately, if I look at what role government should have, it's to create the conditions and shape the environment for private sector and academic ideas that will better our society to flourish. Right? We shouldn't necessarily be the ones, doing everything, but certainly, like the passage of the CHIPS Act, for example, that sets conditions, that shapes the environment, that enables a new generation of entrepreneurs, thinkers, and innovators to come up with the technological know-how to outcompete our adversaries. And if you look at top-down countries like the People's Republic of China or the Russian Federation, for example, just to name two random countries from a list of countries, their systems they're different. They don't reward individualism, free spirit, the ideas that bind us together. There's a lot more adherence to party control and a lot more. I just want to make sure I don't step out of line. That's not the case here. It shouldn't be the case here. And it's through that, by tapping into that awesome potential, which, by the way, is fueled by the incredible diversity we have in this country. Those are things that I think make us stand, ultimately will make America stand the test of time. And that's where I think, as I look at the direction the country's heading, I don't listen to all that doom and gloom that I hear, either on Fox, CNN, MSNBC, name your station. But really we have to look beyond that and say, man, there's a lot of good things happening here. And it comes down to having those conversations and driving this forward, and believing in what we've got.
Yeah. And I guess I should clarify, and I'll just clarify one thing, and thinking about like the perspectives, I guess I'd say that I was Christian raised, fallen, but I haven't gone to church in probably 40 years. So I don't want to overstate that part of it. But the thing that I guess has hit me was just when I remember thinking about, like, when I was a lawyer, how hard it was to become a partner at a law firm, and thinking about how hard it was if you look at the partnership at a law firm, it's going to be largely white men, and then thinking about how much harder it would be if they didn't look like me, and if they didn't so that was just the part of it where I was just like, okay, so I get that, but then we still have our opinion, and we should still be able to have those voices. And I think that's just, everybody has a caveat with their perspective. I don't know where I was going, but I want to take a tangent, because you mentioned that you did airborne, right?
I did, yeah.
I don't think I'd be able to ask somebody, I mean, what's it like jumping out of an airplane? I'm sure you get asked it all the time, but I have to ask that because I can't fathom it.
Yeah, I will. So I'll say a couple things, and I'll say this for whoever listens. I definitely think, one, you have a lot of respect for the act of jumping once you do it, because you realize, wow, this is once you leave that door and that wind grabs you and like hurls you out of the plane, there are some forces at work that you're praying your chute opens at that point, right? And the most beautiful thing I saw in the 3.5 weeks that I was at Fort Benning was my parachute opening without any holes in it, right? That was an amazing sight after leaving that airplane. Yeah, but I was terrified, right? To jump out of that plane, and who wouldn't be, right? And there will be people that tell you, "Oh no, it's great, I've got this." I was scared. I was scared every time I jumped, but I did trust. I trusted my equipment, though, right? I trusted that it would work. I trusted in the training that I was provided before we went out the door. And at the end of the day, I still had a reserve chute strapped to me, so in case something horribly went wrong, I at least had that option to exercise. But it's a pretty phenomenal feeling. And again, I've only done the static line jump from 1,250 feet, where as soon as you leave the airplane, you're essentially counting to 4, and then your chute deploys automatically. And if it doesn't, you better pull that reserve, or you're gonna have about a 10-second ride to the ground. It's not going to go the way you want. But what I thought was interesting too, aside from just the getting yourself to walk out that door or walk off that ramp, is how loud it is in the plane when you're in there, and the anxiety and the adrenaline you're feeling before you go. And then once that chute's opened up and you're floating through the sky, how quiet it is, and you can hear your heart pounding, and you can hear your own breathing at that point. And then the plane kind of flies away, and it's just dead quiet. So that was kind of an interesting kind of sudden change in your ambient environment. But yeah, it was a 5-jump course, and then at the end of that 5th jump, we all got our airborne wings. And I mean, I was I was 20 years old at the time, so I was pretty excited. I was my first piece of bling on my uniform, and it was a really cool experience. And I luckily got to continue jumping. I served in special operations for 6 years, um, and so I got plenty of opportunities to keep jumping.
Wow. And always like from like 1,200 feet, or do you ever jump from higher elevations to where you have, I guess, a lot of time to think about the terror of plummeting?
Yeah, yeah. So I was as an intelligence officer assigned to special operations units. I did the 1,250 feet variety each time. The operators at those units typically go to military freefall training. So they get to do the higher jumps where you got to pull your own chute, and there's a lot more things you have to consider. But that said, even at 1,250 feet, again, there's a number of things that could go wrong. So luckily for me, I was blessed to never have any issues. But I think I've got 25 jumps total. So in each of those circumstances, it all went according to plan. Uh, but
Wow.
uh, but again, it's funny too because someone said because I'm kind of afraid of heights a little bit. I'm less so now, but I certainly was when I was younger. But one of the instructors said, "Look, man, when you're up in that plane, it's not like jumping from a tower or something like that, like bungee jumping. It's like jumping into a postcard." And I thought, oh, well, if I think of it that way, then it's not so bad. And actually, that helped. So it helped me get over that fear and helped me continue doing it.
Wow.
And actually, it was fun, even though you're scared when you're doing it, but it's also fun at the same time.
Yeah. What would you say? I mean, is there one particular characteristic that you saw? And I guess you said you were in special forces, right? So is
Yes.
that Green Beret, or because forgive me, I'm not up on my army terminology like I should be.
Yeah, no, of course. I was assigned to First Battalion, 10th Special Forces Group. So the folks that do the assaulting and all of those things, those are the Green Berets.
Hmm.
The color of my beret was maroon.
Hmm.
I was not a tabbed Special Forces soldier. I did not go to the Special Forces Assessment and Selection course. But every Special Forces unit has support functions. So you've got your maintenance people, you've got your supply folks, you've got your medical folks, and then you've got your intelligence people. And so that was my role. It was providing advice to the battalion commander on all things related to intelligence. And then in Afghanistan, my third and fourth deployments were with 10th Special Forces Group, and that was primarily in kind of a targeting role and trying to assist our teams on the ground that were going after targets. So that was my role there. So yes, did serve with a lot of folks that I would consider heroes, folks that were just great Americans doing some pretty incredible things.
And what is there a characteristic, like one of the things that I had heard about Navy SEALs, and I can't say I like kind of was working too closely, if at all, with any Navy SEALs, but that my understanding was that they were not like what you'd think. Like it's not some kind of crazy macho guy, but somebody who actually is very like would seem most very relaxed because they're going to be in these high stress situations. So therefore their personalities were actually pretty chill. So they could kind of adapt to those kind of things. Was there some kind of personality trait or characteristic that you saw that got people to not just survive but thrive in like extremely unbelievably high stress, high highly important situations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest thing that comes to mind right away is adaptability. And that was true for the operators as well as the support folks, is being able to adapt to the environment, especially if you're in a high stress environment that can rapidly change. Um, Folks that are not able to adapt and overcome some of those things are typically not the ones you'll find in those units. Um, so I think that's the biggest thing. But yeah, I've had my experience in both 10th group and then later with one of the special mission units, was that everybody was very competent. Everybody was very good at what they did. They took pride in what they did, and again, that just ability to execute the mission, even when you didn't always have all of the details, but you had a very clear commander's intent. And so you were able to adapt and overcome some of the obstacles and challenges in your way to get there. And so serving with people of that caliber was my, again, I was in awe of some of the folks that were to my left and right, and was very just proud to be a part of that community to really accomplish some of the most difficult missions that are assigned.
Yeah. Wow. The and I guess to talk about like diversity of like people, and also diversity of personalities. And I am not very adaptable, which is why like I probably can only do 4 years in the Navy. And I'm and then when my perspective on like successful lawyers, that they were almost unflappable, which is related, I think, to being adaptable. And I think I would probably consider myself somewhat flappable, and my family might even say very flappable. But one of my, I guess two of my kids are particularly like this. They are a bit stubborn, like myself. But then I'll say in their defense that like sometimes the stubborn people are the ones who change the world, and
Sure.
at least that's my tie into myself, my own little like businesses. I just saw. I see a deficiency in how our children are being taught about the rest of the country, and I decided that I'm not going to be adaptable, and I'm going to try to fix it. So
Yeah.
toot my own horn for my one of my weaknesses.
Well, but again, I think the other thing is all of us have weaknesses, and it's also a matter of identifying those and being able to turn those disadvantages into advantages, right? Which I think you've done phenomenally, and I think that the work you're doing is incredibly important. Which is why I was honored to have you invite me to do this, and two, any chance I get to talk about some of the great work being done in this country to bring folks back together and to really focus on some of the things that are uniting rather than dividing, because and again, I think we've heard this a number of times. There is an existential threat overseas, and the People's Republic of China is as we've heard from DoD, we've heard from other parts of government. I mean, that is a long-term threat to our way of life, and we really need to focus on countering that effectively, but not reacting to that, but really taking the lead in that and shaping the future in a way that benefits all Americans. And part of that is having those conversations back home. So thanks for all of that, because I think it's an incredibly important thing that you're doing, and yeah, wholeheartedly support that.
Oh, thanks. And I guess in terms of like thinking about, I guess, existential threats or things out there, is one of the things that I'll like tell my kids about, I guess, doing well in sports or in school, is like really actually don't compete with the other people. You just want to be a better version of yourself every day. And I think, and if you do that, then I think you can trust in yourself. And I think that I would definitely say that for our country is that, I guess they're out there, but the best thing that we can do is just be the best versions of ourselves that we can be. And I think with that, I would have, every confidence. And I think that was like, I was living in New York City on 9/11, and I was running up and down the streets of Broadway looking for my wife at that time to see whether she was alive or not. And we finally did meet. But I must say, like, I found that day this was scary, and like for the city, everybody was kind of in a combat situation, right? Um, what I have found more disorienting in the last few years is I kind of felt like that fabric of the country was kind of fraying uncomfortably so, whereas I felt like 9/11 there was a threat, but you still felt the fabric of the country was solid. It was just had been violated, whereas this felt more like it's becoming more asunder much more broadly. But I think that I do sense that like in my conversations, that I find almost near unanimity with people who want to not feel the anxiety that they have. And I think that I don't watch the news anymore, because I think that the practice of yellow journalism that's always been there is there, but now it's 24/7, and it's got so many more tentacles than it ever had before, that's what's freaking people out. And if you just kind of treated the news of now like it was treated a generation ago, where maybe you listen to it for an hour and then you just shut it off, it'd all be better for our psyches and for our assessments about the state of the country, because all we learn about are the problems in the news, and the problems in the news that grab your eyeballs. And there's like so much good out there, and if you just go out and meet fellow Americans and look around, you see all the good, and you see where you can actually fix the problems yourself.
That's the thing, right? When you talk to your neighbors, when you talk to folks you meet, I typically have positive interactions. So I think having the one-on-one conversations and conversations in a group setting, and you know, in a way that really gets ordinary Americans talking to ordinary Americans, you'll typically find that most people are very friendly, they're very hospitable, they're very accommodating, and they want to know more about you and where you're from, or things that they may not have experienced. So I think you make a great point, and I think if we go back to that grassroots element of talking to one another, I think we can make a lot of progress.
Yeah, yeah. And I've got my three rules of thumb, or just lead with curiosity, respect, and compassion, like with everybody.
Yeah,
And and if you do that with everybody sincerely, then I think any problem can get resolved amicably. But if nothing else, you just have pleasant, informative engagements versus contentious, debilitating, divisive arguments.
yeah, absolutely.
So if it was only really that simple, but I think it's just one person at a time. So.
Right, right.
So, I guess we're just passing the hour mark, so we should probably wrap up. But before we completely wrap up, I'd love to finish conversations by just asking, like, what gives you hope at the end of the day?
Yeah, I think there's a lot that gives me hope. Again, like I said, I'm not one of those doom and gloom folks. I tend to look for the good, and when I see folks like you doing the podcasts like this, when we talked about the folks at Vanderbilt and all the work they're doing to bring folks back to the table to talk to one another. When I see the initiatives, even on the Hill, in the committee in which I work, which is incredibly bipartisan, and people are coming together to solve real problems. And in our spaces, we typically forget, what party we work for, because we're all there to solve real national security challenges. And so when I see that, and when I see Americans coming together, and when I see people actually talking, and when I meet people on the street, like I said, to have a conversation, even with someone that may be completely different from me, with a completely different background and a completely different way they look at life, those interactions, and the interactions that typically end up being positive ones, really give me hope that most Americans are not just out to get at each other's throats. We are here to make this country a better place, and make it a better place for future generations. So I know that all sounds very it sounds very positive, given some of the things that we're seeing globally and some of the things that we're even seeing in this country. But again, it's those one-on-one interactions, and it's that the work ethic I see across the board from Americans that truly care about this great nation and making it better. That gives me a lot of hope. So to echo a number of, I think, presidents who have said it, I think America's best days are ahead of us. I think we've got plenty of work to do, but I think we're doing it well. And I think as long as we keep doing it, well, there's nothing that we can't do.
Here, here. All right. Well, Nick, thanks so much for getting together. Really appreciate this, and the communications, and new friendship. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Take care. Have a good day.
You too.
Thanks.